So welcome and thanks for joining Digital Transformation for the Modern Energy Utility. This event is hosted by Sonata Software, and our speakers today will be Matt Pfohl and Bala Kasi. Bala is Sonata's global digital strategy and platformation leader, and he's a seasoned CXO advisor on transformation mandates and unique approaches to going digital. And Matt is an entrepreneur and a business technologist that spent the last 18 years working with energy and utilities, as well as field service and other project-driven organizations around the globe. Today, he comes to us as Sonata's Vice President of Services Sector Solutions. So Matt and Bala, welcome.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here. And Bala, thanks for joining me in this roundtable discussion.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Matt. Look forward to our discussion.
Well, guys, let's don't hesitate. Let's jump right into the deep end. So what is driving digital transformation for these utilities? Matt, you want to take that?
Sure. Really, we're at a big evolution that's happening at rapid speed, and this paradox that's happening, within the utility industry, whether you're looking at how we bring power to market, how we store power, the consumption of power, and really, the different types of customers today and what their requirements are, and even some of the competition that's coming in the space. But when Bala and I have the opportunity to, sit down with executives and help them with some of their strategic initiatives, the three main pillars that we consistently see is, really about innovation. And so, utilities, when you look at the grid side, have always been very, very much rooted in innovation and looking at ways to continue to improve, how they manage, their grids and resilience of those grids and so on. What you're starting to see a shift now is really kind of on the back office and operations side, and really how do we digitize and how do we transform kind of our core back office, and then how do we bring those two together? So innovation is a huge part of, and even looking at things like mixed reality and augmented reality, how do we empower field personnel, to deliver better quality and kind of have learnings, on the fly. Operationally, this has always been a cornerstone. We're constantly looking at how do we more efficiently, effectively, and predictably manage our resources, people and partners, as well as assets. And then growth. Growth is not just about, the profitability or revenue side that we may see that's important with investor-owned utilities, but it's also important on the cost side. And you think of some of the challenges like co-ops are having in some of the municipalities and so on, where they're having these massive growth, from a population, in these rural areas. And so the pace by which we have to plan for growth and how we plan our capital projects, is tremendously changing. So as a result of that, it's making us rethink our strategies in how we look at investing in technologies to deal with this paradigm shift that we're seeing. So Bala, I know you and I have talked about what we call the 5 Ds, if you can take us, into that discussion.
Sure, Matt. I think you talked about innovation, and then you talked about operation, and then you talked about growth, right? I think the first two pillars are fairly common to any traditional industry segment, such as the utilities, right? So as you see here, the first 2 Ds, especially the decarbonization, decentralization, I think are broadly themes that the utility companies have been drivers of transformation. But I think I would like to touch upon the growth factor, right? I think how does a traditional industry segment like a utilities, right, clearly build growth through asset-light models, and what's driving that are really the 3 Ds to the right of the slide, right, which essentially is it's getting consumerized, very unlike the asset-heavy sort of industries, right? So I think the entire downstream in the utility segment is getting consumerized, where the consumer is having more preferences, is getting much more empowered, and they're actually becoming prosumers, a terminology where they not only consume from the grid, they contribute to the grid, right? The other approach to transformation is, of course, the DNO to DSO, where a lot of utility companies have been trying to sort of embark on this for the last 3-4 years. But I think now it's the time. I don't think they have an option. So I think the emerging business models and also the empowerment of the consumer really paves the natural transformation from DNO to DSO. And the third one, really, needless to say, is really about those young digital natives that are coming in from different other industry segments, which are sort of disrupting every other traditional industry segment. And I don't think the the utility segment is protected from them. So a lot of digital natives in terms of giving unique, innovative services for customers, both in downstream and also digitizing the grid as part of the upstream. So broadly extending on what Matt, that you were highlighting in terms of innovation and operations and growth, I think if you double click on some of those, at least two of those engines, right? I see this is a clear shift, and this requires a new dimension of thinking, reimagining the business for the utility guys to thrive in the new marketplace.
Yeah, and it's I think the challenge is that, when you look at traditional businesses like utility, and we've been somewhat isolated in our own world trying to solve our own, challenges, and and focusing on what we do as a core competency, that the shift is really getting us a bit outside our comfort zone, and is forcing us, to really look at a change, and whether we like it or not, and really look at, how we operate the business, how we drive more predictable, cost or revenue, and then how do we create innovation, is really, at the tip of the spear right now.
Sure.
So what kind of comes out of this is this whole concept of ecosystems, kind of started by McKinsey, and really about what's happening in the business world today is that we've got different contributors entering our value chain that have different ecosystems, and even within our own organization, we have different ecosystems, whether you look at long cycle, short cycle work, plant maintenance versus management of grid, and so on. And so what you're seeing evolved, and Bala, you've seen this across multiple industries, is really this concept of these ecosystems and understanding the importance of ecosystems, and what's our role going to be in that? Are we going to be a builder of an ecosystem that others are going to come in and be participants of? Are we going to be an orchestrator? So we're operating kind of is that middle value chain to, upstream and downstream contributors, within an ecosystem. Are we simply participants? Maybe it's in our customers are requiring us to work within their system. So we have very unique IP kind of, or API rather, integration requirements that we have. So, Bala, kind of talk us through what's, this shift that's happening really in multiple industries today.
Quite simply put, Matt, I think the traditional industry walls are getting broken, right? Which essentially means that value creation has taken a new meaning, right? It's not really that if you are a retailer, if you are a utility player, or if you are probably in the education or the health, you could be disrupted by pretty much anyone else in some other different segment. I mean, for all you know, the largest taxi company does not own any taxis, right? The largest hotel company or hospitality company does not own any physical assets or rooms, right? So I think the value creation is taking a completely new meaning. And very rightly, I think McKinsey is sort of talking about a redefinition of this economic value creation to the tune of about, by 2025, to about $60 trillion of business being completely value created in a different way, right? So I'm seeing this across different industry segments. Maybe some are in very early stages, whereas some of the natural segments for disruption include very consumer-focused segments like the retail or the financial services or media, but then some of the larger traditional industrial segments like manufacturing, utilities, which are slightly asset-heavy. But I'm saying manufacturing is being driven by IoT, and IoT is really creating different, and data is creating newer ecosystems. So there is a secular shift across industry segments, but the manifestation of it and the speed at which it is impacting every industry segment, I think, is varies. And it would be interesting for us to discuss, Matt, and how is this impacting the utilities, and what sort of an approach would traditional utility companies really have to take, right, in this new world and new dimension.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things to look at. One is, what are we seeing out there, Bala, and the conversations we're having on a regular basis. I mean, it even just, this year versus last year with some of our utility customers, and, whether they're already in some expanded service offerings. The example I'll give you is co-ops. We're seeing some of our co-op customers get into home services, get into telecom, and looking at bringing more value to their ecosystem. or you're seeing, we're seeing in some cases retailers that are now getting into the downstream services side. So, and as a result of that, it's creating a totally different business model that we have to look at, and we have to rethink, our core business and how we can adapt to really support these new business models. And so, there's two kind of paradigms that are happening. One, when we look at kind of the core, and I'll let you give some perspective on that because I think you've got a really good perspective on this. But when you kind of look at the three big pillars, and kind of what we know, kind of traditional utility versus, where we see this paradigm shift and where we see some of our customers that are in different stages of this evolution, we're seeing this whole concept come to reality that we were just talking about in the kind of McKinsey model of these ecosystems. So two things. One, you're seeing a migration into markets that utilities otherwise didn't compete in, so being very disruptive. And then you're also seeing competitors that are coming into the core business as we know it, in changing things like how we manage our grid, how we manage our operations, and so on. So, Bala, give us some kind of insights as well as what you're seeing.
Sure, Matt. So I think to cut the long story short, right, I think the utility companies will have to come out of their comfort zone, right? And what does a traditional transformation typically mean? It typically means for a segment like utilities, it typically means rationalization. It typically means bringing in efficiencies, cost takeouts, right? Or it typically means mergers or demergers. So I think these are traditional approaches for transformation, right? But I think with the new order of the way the industry walls have been broken, I think the utility companies will have to start creating value out of their ecosystem, not just look inside. I think they will need to take a very outside-in perspective. So if you take an outside-in perspective, right, I see two or three big blobs that, as you see in the slide there, right. One, of course, is the transformation that's happening on the energy management side, right. You see several stakeholders that are coming there, and the interactions between each of these stakeholders will need to be digitized, right, if value creation and customer experience needs to be enhanced. The second blob that I really see is very surprising. It's a very traditional sort of a model of creation and distribution. So the grid is taking a whole new meaning. The grid is getting digitized, or probably you could say that the grid is getting reimagined as a platform, right? But broadly, I think what's happening is that the consumer downstream is getting a visibility into what's happening upstream and midstream. I think that's the name of the game. So extending on that, the third very critical ecosystem that I'm seeing is really on the downstream side, where the entire services spectrum for the consumer is just not a commodity energy or a commodity power. It's really a whole bunch of core services, adjacent services, and value-added services, right? And these value-added services need not be necessarily pure play power or energy. It can be a whole bunch of financial services which are aligned with some of these utility companies and utility services that these traditional guys are giving. So broadly, I think it is how can you leverage the ecosystem, and how can you create newer experiences and services for your customers.
Yeah, guys, you make a really strong case for an industry that is in disruption, right? They're growing, they're changing, their clients are changing, and an enormous amount, I think, of change has to happen inside these companies. So how does a company prepare for that? How does a utility develop a strategy to transform successfully?
Our experience and what we're seeing in the market, and again, going back to what we talked about, is kind of these, how do we take companies that are born digital and how do we adopt a similar strategy? We're not going to necessarily become the next Amazon, but really, what are the learnings? Because if you look at the context of what platform-based business models and kind of digitally natively born businesses have is, first of all, platforms are the center of their business. And secondly, it allows them to come to market very fast or capture market opportunities very fast. It allows them to transition across markets very fast. And it allows them to become a key stakeholder within the value chain in the markets that they play, because many of the value chain is reliant on their platform because of how it makes it creates value across those stakeholders. So whether it's customers or partners or our own employees, and so it's a very powerful position. So if we can take that same philosophy and we can bring that into traditional businesses, it really changes the value that technology can play within the utility industry. And so we believe platforms and a platform strategy is the key, and it's been proven in multiple markets, and we see the opportunity with utilities, and we're seeing it with our own customers.
That's great. Hey, Bala, can you give us a little bit more perspective on what a platform or a platform strategy is?
Right, Bill. So I think why platforms, right? I think we talked about disruption, we talked about growth, and then we talked about ecosystems. So it's a chain of disruptions in the utilities, right? So if you have to brace yourself to this disruption, right? Obviously, I think as everyone talks about, it's digital transformation. It's a very commonly used sort of phenomenon, right? And if there are 100 different connotations of digital, but I think what Matt, I think you would have seen this as well, right? CXOs and CEOs and the boards are really struggling with is there a meaningful approach for digital transformation, right? It's not really a right or a wrong approach. So when you really talked about platforms, so this is another very common connotation. A platform is just not a technology backbone, right? So we are saying that, look at the born digital companies, right? Matt, you talked about an Amazon, right? Why have they been so successful? I was also talking about examples of one of the largest taxi companies. They don't own a taxi, but they are still, I think, one of the largest. So, platforms are the secret sauce, we think, for born digital companies. So how do traditional companies really embrace platform principles, right? So that is the approach that we talk about as platform thinking. And if you really talk about platforms, they are an embodiment of about 5 principles. One is, I think we've already talked about it. They create value leveraging the ecosystem, right? Second one, ability to rapidly create digital services. You see most of the born digital businesses rapidly creating digital services and experiences for customers based on customer preferences across channels, right? The third one, I think, that you typically see platform companies really establishing is able to scale pretty fast. Of course, from a technology perspective, I think most of these businesses are cloud-based businesses. So obviously, scale is an imperative there. But it's just not about technology. It's also about of building rapid, scalable business models, as you have seen most of these guys really talking about. And of course, the fourth and the fifth one is really about data, and then creating a connected sort of an ecosystem, right? I know most of us are customers of an Amazon or sort of a platform businesses like Uber. I think the customer experience that we sort of experience as part of an ecosystem is simply made possible because of the intelligent use of data by the platform, which essentially means that the platform in itself is self-learning and intelligent and harnesses the data to create unique experiences for customers, right? So we are saying that with the emergence of ecosystems, right, with the emergence of, or with the dissemination of the industry walls, traditional companies, including utility companies, will have to take a platform approach. And then we've sort of looked at an industry platform construct, a very simple construct to essentially understand the manifestation of what would be a platform, a business construct in every industry segment. Right? Before we get into what it means to utilities, let's understand what this construct is. The construct essentially has 3 layers to it. One is it has the value layer, or essentially what we can call as the ecosystem layer, right? Is what is your ecosystem? Right? The second layer is, if you know what your ecosystem is, how can you activate your ecosystem? How can you digitize your ecosystem? Or how can you create interactions in your ecosystem and value from your ecosystem, right? And of course, the third one is, if you're able to activate your ecosystem, and how could you create services for your customers? How could you create newer services for your customers? So which is really about downstream services for your customers. So let's apply this to the utility industry segment and see how does a platform sort of a thinking manifest into an industry construct for utilities, right? The first one, of course, is the reimagine the business as an ecosystem, right? Which essentially means that it is not really about upstream, downstream, or upstream, midstream, and then downstream with power and energy flowing from the top to bottom. It's really about how do the stakeholders in this ecosystem contribute to a grid, and how can they optimize, right? Optimize the peak demand, and how can they really create services from the ecosystem. So it's about energy management. It's about creating smart home platforms downstream. It's about smart metering. It's also probably a sort of a utility marketplace, right? Down the lane. So that's about the ecosystem. Now, if you want to activate the ecosystem, what we are saying is dissect the ecosystem into a set of digital business processes, right? You could have many digital business processes, but predominantly the way we look at an industry construct, at least identify about 5 or 6 broad industry themes, right? Which you can double click into digital business processes, which can be leveraged to activate the ecosystem, which essentially means to digitize your ecosystem, create data, and then services from your ecosystem, right? From a perspective of utilities, I think reimagining the grid or digitizing the grid, I think, is a key a digital business process ecosystem that we are looking at. We are looking at asset as a life cycle management. I think we talked about the asset light model. I think this is a key digital business process. I think that that utility companies need to focus on. Apart from that, I think work management, of course, bring in more efficiencies, bring in much more productivity into the entire work cycle and the field services, right? And needless to say, customer engagement. I was talking about a lot about it downstream, how consumers are becoming prosumers and all that. But then what takes the cake really is about beyond utilities, right? Can you really create newer digital processes that can rapidly create services for your consumers and empower them and make them contribute to the grid? I think that's where the game-changing propositions are that utility companies can adopt to completely up the ante. So once you create the digital business process, the third one, of course, needless to say, I mean, if you don't have a technology, sort of a very robust technology infrastructure and a platform to enable this, to enable the activation of the ecosystem, right? So we typically look at a 16-point technology framework or characteristics. We've highlighted about 5 or 6 key characteristics. I typically call them, Matt, as the who's who of the digital characteristics, right? And especially for something like utilities where everything is getting consumerized, right? Self-services, scalable model, and APIs and microservices, I think, are a no-brainer today. Right? They're actually becoming table stakes for a lot of companies which want to create this self-healing structures and newer services for consumers. Data, needless to say again, right? So fundamentally, I think to completely reimagine and relook, right, and reboot your enterprise in terms of value creation and in terms of creating newer experiences for customers, it's all about understanding and designing your ecosystem, synthesizing them into digital process, and then having a very unique digital platform architecture that can enable the ecosystem and the processes. Matt, are there any examples that you have seen maybe in the utility side from the last 6 months that you've been interacting with some of the CXOs where you see a manifestation of this sort of a construct?
I think it's more about the conversations we're having and how utilities are looking at the realization of this, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the example is that if we're looking at modernizing our ERP or enterprise asset management, work management, what you're seeing is within the plan side of things is starting to see more of this outside in kind of perspective, so they're starting to really think about the different stakeholders. And obviously these are those that I would say are more on the mature side of things, but what's naturally happening is this shift of this very linear process to this very non-linear way of thinking. I think the challenge that we're seeing is that how do we execute on that, and how do we prioritize? And so that's kind of what we're seeing, in the market, and much of what we're seeing out there with our customers today. Obviously, some are well down this path. They've fully architected and designed, and in some cases have implemented their ecosystem, and now they're simply looking at how do we improve on that and bring new services to market and new stakeholders into our ecosystem.
Sure, interesting.
So guys, I think utilities across the board understand that change is coming and change is here. So how do they get there? What's their next step?
So approach is obviously critically important. I think the main thing is really about transformation. I think there's a statistic out there that something like 70% or 72% of transformation projects fail, and it really comes down to how they approach and kind of understanding where you're at in your life cycle to understand how do you prioritize near-term, mid-term, long-term strategy so that we can start realizing some of this modernization, but understand the impact and the value of that. So if you're looking at kind of decisions, let's say going back to Bala's points of those 5 kind of themes, how do we make a decision on really where we kind of start? We know what that long-term 5-year roadmap looks like, and so what we start to look at is really what is the kind of disruption and the kind of the risk element. So that's one rating. We look at the value creation, and so how much value is it going to bring to a particular either stakeholders within the organization or externally? And then 3 is really kind of time to value. And so then from that, we can start to put together a plan. So what we've come up with is a method around what we talked about earlier, which is how do we take this kind of digitally born or platform-centric business model and take it to traditional businesses and help them realize their kind of born digital model, and do it in a very predictable, very efficient, in a very kind of risk-emissive way so that we can simplify this process. And so we came up with a 7-step process. Really, the first thing we look at is really kind of platform maturity assessment. We'll talk a little bit about, what's the context of that, but it's important for, any company to understand where are we at today, truly looking at, as an operation from a cultural perspective, from a system perspective, and from kind of how we're positioned in the market. How do we look compared to our peers? And then kind of what are others doing in the market, around these type of, models so that we can then learn and make better decisions on what our strategy may be. And then kind of the next phase of that is really, what we call the digital agenda or digital mandate or transformation plan or, whatever you want to call it. So this becomes that kind of those core 5 themes that we talked about and really drive how we're going to kind of roll out that strategy. And then, as we kind of get into number 3 there, this is really looking at kind of out of the box thinking around new lines of business or services that we can, bring to market. And so customers can come to us in a multitude of stages. So it's not a linear process where you have to start at 1 and then you end at 7. The key to our process is that we can quickly assess where a customer is at on their journey and then quickly determine what are the downstream actions that need to be taken, so that they can successfully start to realize some of those short-term opportunities, at the same time have a framework that ensures that that they can mature to that kind of best-in-class platform-based business model they're trying to get to. And so one of the key things that we look at is maturity. And if you kind of look at the, across the top there where it says platform consulting, technology consulting, and execution, depending on where a customer is at in their maturity path, which Bala will talk to in a second, will make sense of where we kind of engage, with them. So obviously platform consulting is much more strategic, business related type of work that we're co-collaborating with our customers and kind of reshaping what that future business model looks like, where, technology consulting is they already know what that strategy is. They've got a very clear definition of what their business needs to be to take advantage of this opportunity and this paradigm shift. And now they're looking at really needing technology partners and to help them build that and execute that. And then, or finally, it's really about just purely executing projects. So Bala, when we look at kind of that bottom grid from, the different levels of maturity that we see with customers, can you talk to us a little bit about, what you're seeing there in the market?
So, Matt, I think we are engaging with customers come to us essentially in 4 different stages of maturity, right? So one is typically what we call as early adopters or early boomers, if you can call them that way, right? People typically who are low in the digital curve, and they come to us even in terms of taking our help in defining the digital agenda. So we start off predominantly from step 1 and step 2 of the approach, right? There are a bunch of customers who broadly have a blueprint and an agenda in place and need our help in designing the platform and then executing the platform, right? So the first one that I talked about is typically 1 and 2. 3 and 4 are more mature sort of companies who have leveraged technology at least, right? May not have taken the platform route, but then they have leveraged technology and are probably in the higher echelons of digital transformation, right? From their based on their assessment as well. So that's where quadrants 3 and 4 sort of typically fit in, and we come in from either from designing, executing platforms, and delivering services. 2, 3 things I think which are critical success factors here. One, I think, is really you need to figure out the context of the digital transformation of your customer, right? So I think we typically co-create this with customers. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we have a very structured approach. While it is structured, it's also very fungible. So as you rightly said, Matt, so it could either be a 7-step, it could be 2 or 3 steps, 4 steps, right, depending on where you are in the quadrant. And what I'm seeing with all the, I know, Matt, we have discussed this earlier as well, is that most of the utility companies that we have seen and we have engaged with in the last couple of years are by and large, I think, in 1 and 2, right? And if you compare that with other industry segments, I think that at least from the traditional industry segments, I think most of the other guys as well are broadly either in 2. I see utilities typically either between 1 and 2 or in 1. Right. So it doesn't matter where you are, which quadrant you are. I think what matters is are you able to contextualize where you are in this quadrant, and can we sort of create a very structured, fungible platformation approach, right, as part of the journey.
So guys, great information. You mentioned, you spoke a little bit about the platform maturity. Looks like a couple of ways to move forward. Can you take us through these?
Sure. So, platform maturity assessment is really, I'll talk a little bit about the context of that. So this is typically where very early stage customers that are, not sure what their strategy and model is, and they want to kind of just get an education around what a platform-based business model could look like for them. So this is typically a half-day workshop depending on what we want to cover, but we're bringing to light what we're seeing in the market, what competitors are doing, and kind of what we see based on what we know about them and where we believe that they're at in their journey. And then we do a co-collaboration session around really kind of unpacking that maturity element. It's critically important for customers to own that versus a third party, but we're there to help kind of guide that so that we can then help customers make an assessment of, what would be a viable path for them as the next step, and, whether or not these are near-term projects that could be easily executed, or it's that top-down approach where, we're really looking at kind of revamping our strategy, and we want to start from the very ground up, going back to that model that Bala showed, which is really about those value creation elements, and then kind of starting up from there. So the platform maturity assessment is really to help leadership and operations get an understanding of, really for them, what is the potential platform-based business model, and also to understand what's happening in the markets, what some of their peers are doing, and what are some of the innovations that are happening with these ecosystems that are being created. And now, Bala, talk to us a little bit about platform workshops.
So I think why do we need this structure of a workshop? I think let me talk about the why, then the how, and then the what of this entire engagement model. It's very important, I think, Matt, at the beginning of this transformation journey. I think de-risking the journey is extremely important, right? So I think the construct of the workshop for us is to get a shared perspective, the customer. So it's completely a co-creation sort of model. And you and I have actually worked on some of these workshops, right? Wherein I think we've engaged CXO level sort of an audience, typically in a co-creation sort of a model. The goals and objectives really being, can we define this a roadmap? Can we define the critical success factors for this digital transformation journey, depending on the context of where you are in the journey? I think that's really the why of it. How do we do it? I think I talked about concepts of platform thinking. I think design thinking. So I think a very innovative approach, an outside-in approach of really putting the customer in the middle of everything, right? So if you're taking the utility segment, right? So we could have themes around downstream consumer experience. We could have themes around digitizing the grid. You could have themes around complete energy management or work management. So it's really about synthesizing and identifying, creating breakout sessions, and taking a design thinking approach. So what's the outcome and what is the output? I think 2-3 very key outcomes. One essentially is a roadmap in terms of could be a long-term, mid-term, short-term sort of prioritized sort of platforms, ideating around platforms. What could be those 2-3 platforms that could help you digitize your core or create value-added services? One, B, one of those small programs or initiatives which you can undertake, if I can call them, say, as quick wins, right? Because I don't think a CFOs typically sort of sign this off if we do not have a business case, right? So I think we enable creation of ROI and a business case through identifying and prioritizing on some realizing some quick win programs, high impact programs. And of course, I think needless to say, the other artifacts typically include a business architecture, a platform technology architecture, and some of the digital business processes that I was alluding to. We've also, Matt, I think, as we talked about earlier, right, we've built a fairly robust industry-centric digital process library. I think especially for the utility segment that we've been focusing on for the last 2 to 3 years, right? I think we have sort of, across the 5 teams that we talked about, we've built a fairly robust library, I think, which we can leverage as part of these collaborative workshops.
Yep. Some customers don't have the time and want to immediately look at adopting some of these things. So to Bala's point, we have the predefined models, that are for utilities so that they can kind of fast track on some of these initiatives, while
That's
other
right.
ones we may look at, redefining from the ground up. So.
Sure. Yeah. So one thing, yeah, I think I missed sort of highlighting this, Matt, is I think you could have workshop in a box, which is really about a couple of hours, or it could be 2 to 3 days, or it could be probably a sort of a week-long sort of an engagement, right? Or I think we have had cases wherein I think we've sort of had consulting engagements which span out of these workshops with 2 to 3 weeks sort of an engagement. But by and large, I think the objective here is to contextualize. Again, I keep mentioning that word, right? It's contextualized to the digital agenda and the journey where the customer is as part of his digital transformation journey.
Guys, that's fantastic. You've given us a lot to think about. I think you've made a very compelling argument for leveraging platforms and changing the business model. And I think you've outlined very well some great ways to get started. So I want to first thank you all for sharing your time today. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Bala. If you're interested in reaching out to Matt, his email is m.pfohl@sonatasopris.com. You could set up some time to talk to him about your utility or your specific use case. If you'd just like to hear some more conversations like this between some experts, if you see at the bottom of the right of the screen there, you can go to sonatasopris.com/utilities webinars. This event will be listed as well as some other events. And that will conclude Digital Transformation for the Modern Energy Utility. Thank you.